yay, man. All out of options, nothing to choose. I pissed out on Netflix, I'm sick of the news. I'd sign up to Sky, but I don't wanna pay. I've been on furlough since May. Never go and listen to a Cockney attitude. Ooh, breaking away. Got to find a better way. I'd rather watch Auf Wiedersehen again and listen to what these old men have to say.
Hello, and welcome back to Auf Wiedersehen Again Podcast. This is episode number 17, and this is me, your imitable host, Mr. Andy Sledge, and my co-host and steak purchaser and partner in crime, Mr. George Bradley. George, how the devil are you this week?
Yeah, I'm a steak part eater because I couldn't finish it, but it was good.
Yes. So for those of our listeners and watchers that aren't up to date on our Facebook page, myself and George actually met up in real life this week. And we paid a little visit to our sponsors at Top Gun Tattooing. And unfortunately, I didn't get George drunk enough to be able to partake in Neville and Lottie tattoo. However, next time, Zach was a bit busy this week.
Yeah.
And then George did the gentlemanly thing, and we went out for a podcast lunch, and George picked up the tab. So, obviously we went all out and went to a fine place and had some fun. And I was a bit disappointed in George's performance. As he's already said, George couldn't actually finish his.
It was a beautiful meal, though. It was well worth it. It was lovely.
It was absolutely fantastic. So, we see, we obviously caught up with each other, but let our fine listeners know what else has been going on with you this week, George.
Well, not a lot. That was the highlight. That was the highlight of my week.
Yeah. Well, it was also the highlight of mine, to be honest with you. It was very nice to see you after all this time. We haven't seen each other in real life for quite some time due to the lockdowns.
Yeah.
And we went to a place called The Crown in Playhatch, which is in between Reading and Henley. And they do the greatest steaks. I mean, I'll challenge anyone. I'll challenge anyone to find me a better steak than that they do in The Crown. So yes, it was absolutely fantastic. And then we went for a drink in a pub afterwards, and we caught up, and you gave me the full lowdown on your heart operation.
You got the full boring story. Yeah.
Right. Well, look, it was actually quite interesting. So yes, and so for our listeners that didn't know, George had open heart surgery. How long ago was it now? Was it about 18 months, couple of years, was it?
Yeah, about a year and a half, yeah.
Yeah, and it was all because you had an infection in your tooth.
Yeah, so, that's it. So get your teeth checked.
Yeah,
kids.
Get yourself to the dentist, kids, and don't mess around. So basically that was it. The highlight of the week was that. I've been training a few times. I'm desperately trying to stick to my diet. Obviously you blew that out the fucking water by taking
yeah.
But hey, it was what it was. And so trying to drop the poundage, trying to keep training. It's been a fairly pleasant week, and obviously the sun and the weather is absolutely fantastic. So yes.
I was out this morning. It's absolutely baking.
Yeah. Well, they reckon it's going to rain the next few days, but
well, good. That's what. Yeah, I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah. Clear the air a little bit. So yes, but it is indeed. I think it's 28 and sunny today, so it's definitely going to be a hot one for the remainder of the day. So, if any of our listeners or watchers would care to comment about George's inability to finish steaks or his lack of Neville and Lottie tattoos, which can't say I'm not disappointed in myself. Please do send us in some emails. You can email us in with abuse or constructive criticism to aufwiedersehenagain@gmail.com. That's aufwiedersehenagain@gmail.com. Please follow us on Instagram, which is at Auf Wiedersehen Again Podcast. So that's Instagram at Auf Wiedersehen Again Podcast. Please follow us on Twitter at Auf Again. That's Twitter at Auf Again. Please do like and share our Facebook page among your friends, which is Auf Wiedersehen Again Podcast. And please, if you want to see the pictures of myself and George on our recent meeting and outside of Top Gun tattooing, then you can do so again on the Facebook page, Auf Wiedersehen Again Podcast.
I think that picture added a few pounds. I think that picture added a few pounds to me.
They definitely will. Do you know what? I emceed a boxing show last week, and some of the pictures have come out. Oh my God, I look so disgustingly fat. It's ridiculous. So yes, another reason for me to desperately try and shed these lockdown pounds. So please do like and follow, subscribe to the YouTube channel, which is Auf Wiedersehen Again Podcast. So when you subscribe to the YouTube channel, also please click the bell, and that will alert you to any new episodes. However, if the visage of myself and young George is not to your liking and you would just prefer to hear our dulcet tones, you can do so on all good podcast platforms: Spotify, iTunes, and Google Podcast, Breaker, and many, many more. So new episodes are released every Friday at 10 a.m. Our theme music, as always, is composed and performed by the guitar man, Mr. Lee Dosky. So please, 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 please do like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. As always, we visited our sponsor, who are Top Gun Tattooing of number 12, the Harris Arcade in Reading. Their website is topguntattoo.co.uk. Their telephone number is 0189 968 667. And we have a couple of fantastic offers for our listeners. Offer number one is you are entitled to a 20% discount off any tattoo by going to see Zach. And the code word for your 20% discount is Hadaway and Shiteman. So if you would like to get a tattoo at Top Gun Tattooing from Zach, and you either contact him by telephone or in person and say, Zach, I am an avid listener of the podcast, Hadaway and Shiteman, and Zach will offer you a 20% discount. And if you'd like to see what Zach looks like, his picture is also on the Facebook page.
I got to meet Zach, very nice. Yeah.
You did indeed get to meet Zach. He was a little bit busy and we couldn't tell him. He looked like a fucking idiot with that metal thing in his face. So everyone else, please feel free to contact Zach and tell him he looks like an absolute fucking numpty. So, but the best offer in podcast history, known to man, is the fact that we will also give you a free tattoo. Terms and conditions apply. What are those terms and conditions, I hear you ask? Well, we will offer a free Neville and Lottie tattoo to every one of our listeners. So if you would care to get the Neville and Lottie tattoo, which I printed off the other day, and I've got a surprise for you next week with regards to Neville and Lottie tattoos, but we'll keep that one for them. So as of next week, there is a big surprise for George about the Neville and Lottie tattoo, so you'll have to tune in next week. But until then, if you want a free Neville and Lottie tattoo, what you do is you, email us in at aufwiedersehenagain@gmail.com. We will take you down to Top Gun Tattooing. We will pay for and photograph and film your experience of getting a Neville and Lottie tattoo. So, we also, speaking of free stuff, we are also in the midst of our free giveaway. So we are in the middle of our free giveaway for our genuine signed picture copy of the cast. Well, not all of the cast, actually. Someone pointed out that Noel Clarke isn't on there. And so there's only 6. There's not actually 7. But, yes, so the...
Maybe you ghosted him, I did.
Well, I mean,
ghosted him.
maybe it was a foreshadow of the current situation Mr. Clarke finds himself in. But Yes, so the signed copy picture, and to be honest, the take-up has been very, very strong. So compared to our previous giveaways, we've had lots of people who, so what you need to do is if you want to win this genuine signed picture copy of the cast, you need to go to the social medias, and on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, there are posts. And what you need to do is you need to follow us on the social media channel. You need to like the post. You need to tag 3 of your friends in the comment section of the post, and you need to share the post. So obviously on Facebook, you share it to your newsfeed. On Twitter, you retweet the tweet. And on Instagram, you share it to your story and tag us in that story. And you will then be entered into the competition to win this fantastic prize. So if you want to win this prize, you know what to do. And like I say, it is an absolute genuine copy of the cast and their signatures. Not only that, so as I mentioned, this picture was actually given to me by a Mr. Graham Teasdale. And Mr. Graham Teasdale is the admin of the best and greatest Facebook group to do with Auf Wiedersehen Pet. Well, he's actually 2. There is the unofficial Auf Wiedersehen Pet Facebook group and the Jimmy Nail Appreciation Society. Graham is the admin for both of those. Now, what Graham also does is Graham also sells pictures of Wiedersehen Pet associated pictures, and also he's just started selling these air fresheners. Now, Graham has been kind enough to donate some of these goodies to the podcast, and I got a message off Graham this morning to say that he was putting them in the post today. So within the next few days, they will arrive, and then next week we are going to be able to show you all of the new goodies that Graham has available. So if you wish to purchase any of this genuine signed memorabilia copies, you can do so by contacting Graham on Facebook. Or, like I say, if you would like to win it for free, enter our free giveaway competition on the social media channels. So that is it for the boring stuff right now. And we have a fantastic episode ahead of us. And there are lots and lots of cameos in this episode.
We have a Bond girl. We even have a Bond girl in it.
We do. So, there are lots of cameos in there. And there are also, like I say, some fantastic little bits of trivia with regards to some of the cameos, and we will tell you all about that as and when they appear. So this is episode 17 of the podcast, but it revolves around series 2, episode number 4, and the title of the episode is Another Country. And this episode was first screened in the 14th of March, 1986. So, young George, where do we start? So, there are also, well, there's what I would consider to be a couple of goofs or gaffs, which we might point out. And there's one which is pretty much straight away. So, the episode opens and Dennis is walking through the village towards the phone box, and Sergeant Ives in his little police van pulls over, and he says to Dennis, he says, "Need a lift, Dennis?" And Dennis says, "No, I'm just going to my little office." And he says, "What, Pringle not let you use his phone?" And he says, "No chance. He padlocks it before he gets to bed, man." And then Sergeant Ives says, I hear you got a bit of a problem. Laid off, is it?" And it's like, well, you were there when that happened. You know, Sergeant Ives took Mrs. fucking, to, like, you know, drove her up there, and she was like, you better stop work. And he said, yeah, stop work, I'm going to get a court order. And then he's like, yeah, you've got a bit of a problem. Aye, thanks to you, Sergeant Ives. You were the one that delivered the fucking nosy bitch to fucking tell us to stop grafting. Anyway, so little bit of a gaff there, I think, in the script. And Dennis says, well, word gets around quick. And he says, well, it doesn't in a place like this. He says, me and me lads are at a loose end for a couple of days, so it might cause panic in the streets. And he says, I'll send for reinforcements. And he drives off. So we cut to the villa in Spain, and Vicky and Ali. And Vicky is lying on the bed in her underwear, looking with a face mask and some cucumbers on her eyes, looking very delectable in her lacy underwear. So just to cut back for a second, so it was last week, or was it when did we never actually went through Ali Fraser or Bill Patterson, the actor, what he had done. Yeah. So Bill Patterson has been acting since 1973 and is still working. So he's been acting for over 40 years, over 45 years. So he's been acting longer than I've been alive. And he has 147 credits on IMDb. So he's done 147 TV jobs and films since 1973.
He's a brilliant actor.
He is, but I mean, to be honest, he's not done, you know, compared to a lot of the other cast, a lot of the stuff that he's done has been sort of fairly niche. He's not done your Coronation Streets and your EastEnders and things like that. So he's not much as the others, but he was in The Singing Detective.
Remember it well.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of remember it. It was a little bit before, you know, it wasn't something I watched, but I remember it being on the TV when I was a kid. He was in The Adventures of Baron Munchausen, which was a fantastic film with Eric Idle and some of the Monty Python cast, of the other Monty Python cast. However, as always, he was in Boone. He was another one of the Auf Wiedersehen Pet who was in Boone. He was in Doctor Who, he was in Law and Order, and most recently, he's in a TV show called Fleabag, which I've not watched, but I believe was fair.
Yeah, which is brilliant. Absolutely brilliant.
Oh, that's it? Yeah. I may give it a watch then.
Oh, it's one of my favourite things from last year. Brilliant.
Well,
it's well worth a binge watch.
I shall give it a watch then. So Vicky's lying on the bed, looking delectable, and she says, do you know what? I've been thinking while we're here, I'd like to take tennis lessons. And Ali's like, tennis? And I love the way that he says tennis in the same way that he says Dennis. Tennis! And she says, I always think it's useful to add another string to your bow, like. And he says, well, you took up water skiing in Florida, honey. And I think if I remember right, that lasted about 40 minutes. And she says, well, you're nearly drowned. And he says, what's brought on this sudden interest in tennis? Some bronzed Australian coach down the club. And she says, I just wanted to have something to do while you're on the golf course all day. And the phone rings. And Ali Fraser's, who the heck is that? I'm on the course in 20 minutes. So Vicky answers and she says, it's long distance, it's got that sound. So Ali Fraser takes the phone and obviously it's Dennis on the phone. He says, hello. He says, all right, Dennis, speak up a wee bit, Dennis. It's a hell of a bad line, this. And then he says, what do you mean? We've got a problem. So Dennis is obviously outlining to Ali the issues that they've got with having to stop work. So Barry is, they cut to upstairs into the Barlymore, and Barry is queuing to get in, and he's talking to Bomber. Bomber's obviously in the cars.
A bit of a common theme, the old queuing to the toilet.
Well, yes, exactly. Like as Dennis said in the last one, he said they always find these places with only one bog. So Barry asks the Bomber, he says, are you going to be much longer in there, Bob? And Bob says, do you want a written estimate? And he says, it's just you've been monopolizing it, you know. And he says, well, it's all right for you. You didn't have a curry last night, did you? And Oz pokes his head out the room. He says, morning, morning. And Barry says, is there another lavatory in this place? Ozzy says, I think there's a bog in the backyard, but you'd be desperate. And he says, but if you're desperate, just lob it out the window, man. So Neville shouts up, tease up, lads. And Oz runs down for breakfast in his vest and pants. Oz's traditional morning attire of his white underpants and vest. And Barry says he'll just have to hold it. So they head down, and Pringle is put them down a pot of tea and some toast. The genial host that is Arthur Pringle. And Neville's very nice. He says, morning, Arthur. And Wayne says, morning. And Oz, straight away, he's like, I suppose it'd be too much to ask for a boiled egg, would it? And Pringle that gives him the right hump. And obviously Pringle sees the way that Oz is dressed, and again, it's not making him any very well disposed towards the lads. And he says, tea and toast. I told you that when you registered. I'll get some Marmite. And Oz like, nah, I didn't go into all that trouble, man. And Wayne says, hey, Oz, says, remember what Arthur said? He says, I didn't go all that trouble, mate, man. And he says, remember what Arthur said? He doesn't like to be called mate, chief, squire, admirable, petal, or bike and bows. And obviously, Ian, they're doing themselves no favors. I mean, Arthur's an absolute prick, but they're doing themselves no favors when it comes to winding him up. And Neville says, how do you sleep, Barry? And he says, I did, surprisingly enough. And Wayne says, back in the bosom of your family, ain't it? And Barry says, well, there's a lot of truth to that, Wayne. He says, I can't tell you how much the thought of being with me muckers has sustained me at my time of grief. So Oz, he goes and he stands up by the fire, and he says, oh, how are you, man, Barry? He says, your fiancée hasn't snuffed it, man. She's just got cowled feet for a while. And Oz takes the heat out of the fire and he brings it towards the table.
Yeah.
And Barry says, oh, yeah, pro tem. He says, I think there's something that exists between men that doesn't exist between men and women. And Oz jumps on that as an opportunity to make a joke. He says, who's sharing a room with him? He says, I'm not talking about that, Oz. That's pretty typical of you, isn't that? He says, I'm talking about comradeship, not turd burgling. And
that's a good 80s saying, turd burglar.
Yeah, turd burglar. And Arthur Pringle, he brings out the jar of Marmite. He's like, there you are. And Oz is like, oh, he goes, things are really looking up, aren't they? He says he'll be giving out he'll be giving out forks and spoons and serviette rings next. And Barry just, still on his little theme, he says, I don't think women understand that, you see. And Neville says, what? He says, what I'm talking about, comradeship. He says, I think that's what freaked Hazel out when you lot showed up. I don't know, she felt threatened somehow, she felt like excluded. And I was just like, well, you can't blame us for what happened there. And Barry's like, no. And he says, and Wayne says, I think Barry's right, And I says, how's that? And he says, well, look, any of our women who would have reacted the same, wouldn't they? I mean, they sort of resent our shared past. Neville says, I don't think Brenda felt left out because she didn't share a wooden hut with us lot in Dusseldorf. And Barry says, no, granted. He says, but if us lot had showed up at your place, all laughing and joking, full of the joys of spring, it's bound to have the same effect. And negative Neville, she says, she probably wouldn't have even noticed. Too busy at the hospital playing badminton with doctors. And I think Neville sort of lets the cat out the bag there, and he tries to retract. Because Oz notices, and Oz is like eating his toast. He says, what's this, like badminton with doctors? And Neville says, well, she's her own woman, and I'm all for it. Barry says, I think that makes a very good living, Nev. I think changing role for women is inevitable and right in this day and age. He says, I mean, we can't chain them to the kitchen sink, can we? I mean, I've always encouraged my Hazel in her career. And Oz says, well, I never discouraged Marjorie from taking a career. I would have been quite happy for her to go out and bring a few quid in. But change to her meant something completely different to that. Change to her meant changing from humping the bloke at the rates office to humping the TV repair bloke to humping some gadgie up Wild's End Slipway.
Gadgie, yeah.
And And Wayne says, are we to take it that things between you and your Marjorie aren't altogether tickety-boo? And Oz says, well, would you be after that lot? And Barry says, I'm sorry, Oz, but quite frankly, I think you brought it on yourself. And Oz, like, totally oblivious to his part in things, he says, how's that like? Barry says, well, look, Oz, when we were in the Falklands, right, you never wrote her a letter, you never phoned, you never sent her any money. And Neville says, same as when we were in Germany. And Oz says, yes, but that's simply because that's the sort of woman that she is, isn't it? I mean, she's been humping half a Tyneside while my back's being turned. And Barry says, but which came first, Oz, the chicken or the egg? Your neglect or her promiscuity? And after all, the love you take is equal to the love you make, in the words of John Lennon. I was never quite actually sure what it meant. So Dennis walks in and says, good morning, and everyone says, hello, Den. And Wayne says, you're up with the lark, son. And Neville asks him where he's been. And he says, I've been talking to Ali's brief. He reckons that this preservation order on the house, you can always apply to the Department of the Environment. And everyone's like, And Oz says, the government, he says, well, that's that knackered then. He says, because them can't make their minds up and out like that lot, bar closing doing pits. And, there's a little bit of a tiny little bit of a theme here when he talks about closing down pits. There's they mention Arthur Scott a few times in that, which obviously, this was the, I'm sure it was, was this before or after the miners' strike? I'm sure it was probably after, wasn't it?
Well, Arthur Scargill was pretty active during the miners' strike. He was famously arrested and everything, dragged off.
Yeah. I mean, it was, the miners' strike was, it was pretty brutal, wasn't it? So,
but he was really a thorn in the side of Thatcher. He was. They're always causing trouble.
Yeah, well, but it was Thatcher. She sent the old bill in and they bashed the fuck out of all the miners, didn't they? I mean, it was pretty fucking horrible.
Oh, Jesus, yeah. There's plenty going on there, yeah.
Yeah, so anyway, Barry says, we're going to be wrapped up in red tape forever, aren't we? Do you know how I tried to, he says, do you know I tried to get me granny a rebate on a gas bill once, took me 18 months and it was only for 22 quid. Neville says, if we've got it down tools, I can't afford to hang around here indefinitely. I mean, we'll not get paid, will we? And Dennis, trying to keep the peace, says, look, I'm in charge of the account. I'm the signatory on the checkbooks. You'll all get your money. And Neville says, aye, but for how long though, Den? How long before Ali gets on the phone and cancels the account? And Oz says, could be a while if he's trying to deal with British Telecom. He's probably never get through. And Arthur, Arthur's like moves the fire back. And Oz is like, what are you doing? What are you doing? And Arthur's, he sees, he overhears the conversation. He goes, do I take it that you're leaving? And Dennis says, no, we're not yet. And Oz goes and grabs the fire and moves back. And Wayne says, if I were you, Arthur, I'd get in a dartboard and a video and a couple of pool tables, some of the amenities which your hostelry is sadly lacks. And he says, Arthur says, well, you're not hanging round here. And then he goes, and I'm not doing lunches. Yeah, Mr.
Not doing lunches.
Mr. Hospitality. And Wayne makes a joke. He says, he's a diamond Arthur, ain't he? So anyway, we cut to a truck stop cafe, a roadside cafe, and we find Moxie is asleep. And at the next table, do you know who's at the next table?
Yeah, the guy who's in the Falklands. With,
there we go. Look, so Paddy, Oz's mate Paddy. Now, obviously, it's not made clear whether he's actually supposed to be playing the same person. So obviously, it's the same actor who played Paddy in the Falklands, sat at the table in the truck stop. Now, is this supposed to be a coincidence that Paddy is there? Or is he just supposed to be playing some random dude? We will never know. But I'd like to think it was a little bit, I'd like to think that the writers and the directors maybe did that, to, like I say, put a little bit of a nod at the ships passing in the night. And so the owner, the manager, wakes up Moxie and he says, hey, this isn't a doss house. Chuck. He calls him Chuck. So obviously, they must be in around the, what is it? That's a sort of a Nottingham phrase, isn't it? Something like that. So
Yeah.
And Moxie says, sorry, mate, can I have another tea? And one of those buns as well. And so there's one of the truck drivers speaks to Moxie. He says, what are you driving then, pal? And he says, I'm nothing. He says, I'm riding me thumb. He says, I was working, on this building site, and I got a phone call to say that my wife had been taken into hospital down in London. So obviously Moxie's making himself up a little bit of a backstory here. And the driver says, nothing serious. He says, I don't know. He said, there could be complications like. And the driver says, well, I can take you as far as Hatfield. And he says, really much obliged to you. And he says, what hospital is he in? What hospital is she in? And he says, Paddington, which, you got St. Mary's Hospital there at Paddington. Mm-hmm. I don't know if Moxie knew that, whether he was just...
Yeah, I was in a pub opposite that hospital the other day.
Yeah? Yeah, what were you doing?
When I left you, got to Paddington.
Oh, yeah.
I went to the pub opposite, yeah.
Yeah, well, I've been in a lot of those pubs myself. So obviously I used to work in London, so I used to get the train. I used to get the train back and forwards all the time. So yeah, I've found myself in a couple of those pubs previously. So we cut to sunny Marbella, and we are on the golf course with Kenny Ames and Ali Fraser. Now, also Kenny Ames was a so Kenny Ames had 28 credits on IMDb, but he was it 28 or 78? I can't read my own writing then. Oh, it might be 78. Anyway, Kenny Ames, he died in around 2006. He died in 2005, but his work was spanned IMDb for 50 years, from 1956 to 2006. And so the actor James Booth, Kenny Ames, he was in some pretty impressive stuff. So he was in the film Zulu with Michael Caine.
Zulu, yeah. The coward who came back.
Yeah. He was in Bonanza. He was in The Sweeney. He was in The Jazz Singer. Yeah. He was in an episode of The Fall Guy. So he did a lot of stuff out in America. He was in Bergerac, which is also a bit of a common theme in this episode. A lot of the cameos, the people have been in Bergerac. He was in Twin Peaks in America. He was in Lovejoy, Minder, The Bill, and he was. Are you waiting for this one, George? He was in the cinematic genius that was American Ninja 4.
I think I missed that one. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, some would say that Zulu was the highlight of his career, but, American Ninja 4, my good lordy lord.
Yeah.
So, yes, like I say, James Booth, who played Kenny Ames, had a 50-year career and was in some pretty spectacular stuff. So, Ali Fraser turns up on the golf course to meet Kenny, and Kenny says, "Good morning, Ali." And Ali Fraser says, "No, Kenny, it is not a good morning. It is not a good morning." And he says, "Oh well, if your mood's going to affect your game, we'll double the ante." And he says, "I
quite like Ali's outfit as well. It's very, very golf.
Oh yes. And he says, "You are the cause of my mood, Kenny. You could say that I'm a wee bitty peeved with you." And Kenny said, and acting all innocent, he says, "Oh, why didn't you like the little masseuse I sent you last week? She did wonders with my backswing." And he says, "I'm talking about the house, Kenny. Why did you not tell me it was a listed building?" And Kenny, as innocent as they come, he just says, "We didn't ask." And he says, "How am I supposed to turn it into timesharing units when it's got a preservation order slapped on it?" And Kenny says, "I didn't know that was your intention." He says, "Piss off, Kenny. You didn't think I was going to live there, did you?" And he says, "Yeah, I did, actually. You better tee off, son. There's some people coming." So Ali Fraser tees off very badly, digs up the turf and creates a divot, and Kenny Ames laughs. And he says, oh dear, what bad luck." And he goes to tee off, and he says, "I was actually going to live in the place when I first bought the drum." He says, "I rather saw myself as a country squire, got myself all kitted out, guns from Purdy's, suits from Dax, bought myself a fishing rod for Range Rover." And then he's quite a funny joke. So Kenny Ames, he's just about to take his shot and he shouts down the fairway, he shouts, "Quattro!" And Ali goes, "What?" And he goes, "4, you Burke." And he hits his drive and it lands in a far better position than Ali's days. And Kenny says, "I even went up there a few weekends to inveigle myself with the local populace, invited the neighbours over for sherry, even opened a bleeding church bazaar." And Ali says, "The local populace, I assume, were quite unaware of the fact you were London's leading pornographer." He says, "Oh, yeah, I mean, I kept that stum. I hinted at the rag trade. I was really trying to get it. I was really getting into it. One day I woke up and I thought I'd even like to end my days here. Wasn't being morbid, more philosophical, really. I thought if I snuff it, I'd rather like to do it in a typical English rural setting, preferably with a cricket match on the village green." And Ali Fraser says, "And is there honey still for tea?" And he's quoting a famous poem there. And Kenny says, "What?" And he says, "It's Rupert Brooke." And he says, "Who's he? One of Ronnie Knight's mob?" And Ali Fraser says, "No, he's a shared your newfound affection for the joys of England." And he says, "Oh, I must give him a read. Is he one of the modern ones?" And Ali says, No, long gone, Kenny." And he says, "He died in a foreign field, which is exactly what you will do." And Ali goes, "I was set up. That's the tragedy of it." And he says, and Ali Fraser says, "I feel a wee bit the same way." And Kenny says, "Oh, come on, Ali, you've acquired a beautiful residence well below the market value. All you've got to do is restore it to its former grandeur. Why don't you turn it into a fat farm?" So we've obviously, we've realised that, there's no honour among thieves there. Kenny Ames has took that further up. And Ali is now paying the price for, his greed. So do you remember when Ali's lawyer said, he goes, "I haven't even had time to do the usual checks." And Ali went, "Don't worry about that."
Yeah.
And he was like, "Well, that's come back to bite him on the arse now." So we cut back and we're outside the barley moor, and Neville and Bomber and Barry and Oz are playing football in the car park, and Arthur Pringle is coming back and Oz nearly hits him with a ball, and he says, "Will you please be careful?" And Oz says, "Calm down, Arthur, calm down. There's a lot of skill on view out here, there won't be any loose balls." And he says, "Why did you go to a field if you want to do that?" He says, and Wayne says, "Because it rained overnight, Arthur, and you don't want us traipsing your lovely hostelry with muddy boots now, do you, Arthur?" Aye. And then Den pulls up in his camper van, and Neville says, "How's Den?" And Oz says, "Where have you been?" He says, "I've been with the architect." And Oz says, "Oh, aye, what's the beef then?" He says, "Well, he's got a meeting with the council this afternoon, and he'll let us know what we can do and what we can't." He says, "But now it's going to happen the next couple of days. So if any of yous want to shoot home, that's up to you, like." And Noel says, "Are you?" And he says, "No." He says, "I've got a hang round here, haven't I?" He says, "I rang Norma and told her to come down, Might be a bit of fresh air for her, might stop at the Cross Keys." And Wayne says, "I hope you told her to bring you a tie." And Bomber says, "I could go home, but it's a bloody long way to Bristol. And if we get the go ahead, I don't seem to be worth it." And Wayne says, "It's a bit of a pisser though, isn't it?" And Barry says, "It suits me after what I've been through. Be a sort of timeout, as they say in those American football games." And Oz says, "It's a fine kettle of fish as far as I'm concerned." And again, Oz, always bringing the dark side and always trying to blame somebody for what's happening. He says, "It's a fine kettle of fish as far as I'm concerned, isn't it?" He says, "You told me there was a good gig doing here, Dennis, so I cancelled all my existing plans to help you out." And he says, "Yeah," he says, "I've been
what existing plans, yeah."
He says, "I've been down here, 48 hours, and I'm laid off already." And Dennis is just like, "What bloody plans have you had to cancel?" And Oz says, "Well, I had irons in the fire. Of course, I've had to blow them all out now, haven't I? Trying to do ye a favour." And Dennis says, "Look, you're being paid, Oz." And he says, "Oh, aye, for a week." Dennis says, "Aye, during which time things will be resolved. Look, they were bound to find some sort of work for her. Says, how the hell was I supposed to know this was going to happen? And Bummers, sticks up for Dennis. Says, quite right. He says, Den's right. Won't do us any harm to have a couple of days free. Neville says, this is meant to be some nice scenery round here. Apparently there's a famous waterfall within driving distance. And Oz is like, who wants to go and see a tossing waterfall like, eh? And Wayne says, there's bound to be a bit of action somewhere, just a question of sniffing it out. And we find out later that Wayne sniffs out some action and it does nobody any favours. And Dennis says, he says, well, if you do sniff it out, be discreet. So again, this is all foreshadowing for later. And he says, they already think we're the wild bunch around here. Didn't give them any cause to prove it. All right. And also says, I suppose looting and raping and pillaging is out of the question, eh? And Dennis says, you know what I'm talking about? Just try and behave like adults. And there's a car pulls up with a woman in it. It's a mini metro. You ever have it? You ever been in one of them? I remember my mother had a mini metro when I was a kid.
Yeah. I was doing driving lessons in one of those.
Yeah. In fact, I think it was around this time. Very popular vehicle of the time. And I'm pretty sure that my mother had it. I'm pretty sure it was blue.
Well, initially, Princess Diana had a mini metro.
Oh, did she? Well, look, there you go. Look at that.
Princess Diana had a mini metro.
There we go. We used to drive around in the same car as Princess Diana. There's a fact for you, George. It's a good job you're here. Look at that.
Yeah. She moved on to other better vehicles.
Yeah. Like a Mercedes in a tunnel in Paris, for example.
Yeah.
Anyway, so the car pulls up and Oz says, it's bloody great this, eh? He says, I've had more fun in the Falklands. And Barry says, I think it's going to rain. And Bomber says, I wonder what sort of state poor old Moxie will be in. And Oz says, let's just hope he doesn't try to light a fire to keep warm. And Neville says, looks like we've got a new resident. And they all look at the girl. And Wayne's very taken with her. He says, she can move in with me if she likes. And Neville says, fat chance you've got. And Wayne says, nothing ventured, nothing gained. And Wayne heads over to talk to the young girl. And Barry says he doesn't change as he says, how are you, man? Are you going to play? So Wayne approaches the young lady and he offers to carry her bag and he says, let me take that, far too heavy for a girl like you. And she says, oh, thanks. And he says, are you staying here? She says, just for a couple of days. And then Wayne proceeds to put his foot in it. He says, oh, well, you'll bring a ray of sunshine into a drab existence. My name's Wayne. And she says, my name's Carol. And he says, well, welcome to our humble abode, Carol. It's a bit of a naff place, mind you, and the landlord's a right misery. He says, I think he took this pub when they turned him down for the wheel clamp unit. And Pring Arthur runs up and says, hello, Carol, and gives her a big hug and a kiss. And she says, hello, Daddy. And obviously the camera looks at Wayne's face and it is Wayne's shocked. And Arthur grabs Carol's suitcase off Wayne and he says, I'll take that. And just as he does that, Oz kicks the football and breaks the window. And then the camera then pans in on Arthur Pringle's face and Arthur Pringle has a similar look to what Wayne had a second ago.
Yeah.
So we cut to the Cross Keys and Dennis is with the architect, Howard Radcliffe. And he's on the phone and he puts the phone down. And he's in the phone box and he puts the phone down. And
are we going to mention the girl? Who the girl is?
Oh, sorry. Yes.
The girl.
Tell us, George. Tell us.
Catherine Rabbit, but she was really known as Katie Rabbit.
Yeah.
Famous girlfriend of Prince Andrew.
There we go.
And a Bond girl.
Yes. So she had 26 credits on IMDb, including the Kenny Everett Show, where she played one of the saucy girls on the Kenny Everett Show.
Yeah, she was in Hot Gossip. She was a dancer in Hot Gossip.
Oh, look at that. George, you're coming out thick and fast with the trivia today. And she did
this is my era. I used to watch Hot Gossip every week.
Well, I do remember the Kenny Everett Show. It was like in the best possible taste. But again, I think I was a bit young to understand a lot of the humour. And then he died of AIDS. And she was in Manta. Bergerac, as we mentioned earlier. She was in an episode of Poirot.
Yeah.
She was in Doctors, and she was also quite recently in Emmerdale. But as you quite rightly pointed out,
she was in You Rang My Lord. You Rang My Lord.
All right, yeah. And
do you remember the spin-off from Heidi High? Yeah.
Oh, was that a spin-off of Heidi High, was it?
Yeah, and all the characters in from Heidi High. And she was kind of the posh.
I do remember
posh lady in that. Yeah.
I do remember vaguely the program. I didn't realise it was a spin-off of Heidi High though. So, because I remember Heidi.
Well,
High,
sort of, yeah. It had all the characters in it.
I mean, Heidi High. That was like one of the biggest shows on TV at the time, wasn't it?
Yeah. I see Ruth Maddock drinks in my. Not Ruth Maddock. Miss Cathcart. That one. What's her name? In Heidi High. She drinks in my local from work.
Yeah.
Eh?
What, the Welsh one? You know there was the.
No, she's Sue Pollard.
Sue Pollard. Yeah, the one that played the cleaner, Peggy.
Yeah. She drinks in my local from work. Yeah, she comes in and says Heidi High to everyone.
Oh, really? Yeah, like that. Come on, it was only.
Yeah, she goes Heidi High.
You know, it was only 50 years ago.
And everyone goes, hoody ho.
Well, you know, it's about time you let that one go, maybe, love. Yes, so like I said, she was in the Living Daylights. So, but yes, it was, the Living Daylights was that Timothy Dalton, wasn't it? The word, like one.
Yeah, not one of my favourites.
One of my favourites. Like basically the worst Bond ever, isn't it? So,
but she looked good in it. She was very good in it. She looked great.
Well, I don't think they ever had an ugly Bond girl, did they?
No.
So, like I say, we cut to the Cross Keys. And like I say, Dennis is with Howard Radcliffe. Howard's on the phone. He puts the phone down and he comes and sits down. And Dennis says, "What's the form like?" And he says, "Sorry." He goes, "Well, what did the council say?" He says, he says, "Much as I expected. The procedures on listed buildings are fairly standard." He says, "I could appeal to the DfE, but that would take a year." And Dennis says, "So we've had it then?" He says, "No." He says, "There's a degree of flexibility." He says, "I mean, there's no way we can rip the guts out of the house and we cannot and convert it into timeshare units." He says, "But if I can convince the council that we plan to restore the house without changing the original facade, there will be certain alterations we could make." And then Norma arrives and Dennis says, "Excuse me, my sister's just turned up." And he says, "Hello, Pet, you've made good time." And she says, "Oh, listen, I've left your clean washing in the back of the car." And Dennis is all a bit embarrassed. Says, "Oh, not now, Petal, I'm with the architect." He says, "I'll tell you what, you get checked in and I'll get you some tea." And she says, "Thanks, that's lovely, thanks, Den." And then so Dennis sits back down with Howard and he says, "Is that what Ali wants though?" And Howard says, "I don't know yet, Dennis." He says, "But what I do know is that Ali bought the house as an investment. He didn't buy it to live in." He says, "Can you see him and Vicky as Lord and Lady of the Manor?" And Dennis makes a joke.
Lady of the Manor.
And he says, it's too far away from her hairdressers. And Howard asks for a fresh pot of tea and another. And Dennis says, "Can I have another cup?" And he says, "Mind you, whatever Ali decides to do with a house, it's going to take you a while to draw the plans up, isn't it?" And he says, "There's not much point in my lads hanging around." And Howard says, "Not necessarily. Whatever we do, there's a certain amount of spade work that needs to be done." And then says, "Well, the sooner you get them back to work, the better." He says, "Because God knows what they'll get up to round here." So they are the couple of the lads. So Oz and Bomber and Barry go for a walk around the village, and there's a dog barking in a garden, and it sort of shocks the lads. And Oz says, "Bloody hell," and Bomber says, "There's no need for that." And he tries to, pet the dog and calm him down and says, "Good boy." And Oz says, "Oh, that's an attack dog, that is. It's trained to go for the working class." Bomber says, "Not used to strangers, are you, boy?" And Oz says, "Well, that's the sort of welcome we can expect round here." And Barry says, bit of Alsatian in him, I think. And then the owner comes out, and he's not just, he's clearly not a very nice person. He says, why are you annoying my dog? And he says, what? He says, he doesn't bark for nothing, which he clearly did. And Bomber says, having a stroll.
Most dogs do.
Yeah. And he says, who are you people? And Oz, quite rightly, says, who exactly do we have to be? He says, I mean, what are you doing round here? And Barry says, well, everyone's got to be somewhere, sir. And he's just very much an unwelcoming, unpleasant chap. So, and then we cut, and Neville is in the shop, and he's buying a few bits, and the shopkeeper says, that's £7.50 exactly. Are you staying in the village? And he says, yeah, the Barley Moor. And the shopkeeper says, a bit early for tour. He says, no, me and my mates are doing a job here. And she goes, oh, you're the workmen, are you? The ones at Thornley Manor. So obviously the jungle drums have been beating round the village, and everyone knows who they are. And she said, and he says, well, we were till they stopped us. She says, well, we were till they stopped us. And who we find out is Sir James, a very well-spoken gentleman. He says, excuse me, does that mean you're out of work? And Neville says, well, not exactly, just at a loose end for a couple of days. He says, well, the thing is, I'm doing a few bits to my own house, and I could certainly do with some expert advice. Would you be interested? And he says, aye, well, I might be. He says, well, look, why don't I give you my phone number, and perhaps you could bring me later. So we cut back to the Barley Moor, and Wayne is fixing the window that Oz brought earlier. And
as Sir James is his most other famous role.
Well,
was in Faulty Towers.
Yes, he was. Yeah, do you know which one?
He played the same sort of character, didn't he?
Yeah,
same
right.
upper class.
Well, apparently he is quite typecast. That's what it said in IMDb. But I was actually going to mention it later because we're waiting.
Okay. All right.
When his wife comes on, there's a mildly interesting fact about those people. So like I say, Wayne's fixing the window, and Carol brings him out some tea. The lovely and delectable Carol. And she's like, I brought you some tea. And he says, oh, cheers, just finished as it happens. And she says, is that your job, windows? And he says, only when the lads have got a ball. He says, basically, I'm a chippy. And he says, here, look, I'm sorry about rubbishing your old man. Me and Arthur get on like a house on fire. And she says, well, that's more than I do. And Wayne senses an opportunity. He's like, oh, yeah, bit iffy, is it? And she says, since my mum left, he's got worse. Really, all his children are a terrible disappointment to him. He says, how come? And she says, none of us joined the Air Force. My sister lives with a lecturer, and my brother's gay and runs a health food restaurant. So you can imagine having a gay son running a health food restaurant is probably not Arthur's favourite.
A little bit anti that, I'd imagine.
Yeah. Probably not his favourite topic of conversation. And he says, oh, yeah, what do you do? She says, I'm studying sociology at Nottingham. And again, studying sociology probably isn't very high up Arthur's list of achievements. And then he asks where, and he says, and then where? And she says, as far away as possible. And he pulls a fag out, and he offers her a cigarette, and she takes it, and he lights the fags up, and she says, I used to love it around here when I was a kid. I can't stand it now. The people have changed. They're all the rich overspill from Sheffield or retired Tories with nothing better to do than complain about Arthur Scargill. So, and Wayne says, I reckon our presence here has raised a few eyebrows. And then Arthur Pringle comes round the corner and sees Carol with Wayne. Like they play some military style drums in the background. It's like, it's quite funny. A little bit of a burst, like a bit of background music of military style drums, and he goes, Carol, like, very much like a sergeant major would. And she sighs and stands up, and she goes, I'll see you later. So next we cut, and Moxie is in a pub looking pretty shifty. and an even shiftier looking dodgy geezer approaches Moxie. And he's an Irish fella, and he says, "Are you the one that
I think this is an Irish establishment in London."
Well, yes, exactly. That's what I was going to say. So obviously Kilburn, Cricklewood, Kentish Town, they're the that's like the, well, it's basically your manor, isn't it there, young George, more or less? You're not too far away from Kilburn, are you?
Yeah, I would say it's probably Biddy Mulligan's in Kilburn High Road, which was the dodgiest Irish pub in the 80s you can imagine.
Yeah, full of IRA and shit like that, yeah.
Yeah, the old hat went round for the collection, everything.
Yeah. Well, there used to be a pub in Reading called the Battle Inn, and they used to collect for the cause in there apparently. So, but yes. So anyway, so like I say, they're in. Moxie's got himself to London. He's in a moody looking pub in London, which we would assume is in Kilburn. And like I say, you what was the name? What did you say it was called? Possibly.
But Biddy Mulligan's.
Oh, well, it sounds dodgy. Anyway, so dodgy geezer approaches Moxie and he says, "Are you the one that wants the doings?" And Moxie says, "Yeah." And he goes, "It'll cost you." And he goes, "Well, I didn't think you were going to go away." And he says, "Have you been inside?" He says, "Does it show?" He says, "You can usually tell." He says, "How long have you been out?" And he says, "I'm still in, mate." And the guy smiles. He says, "Temporary leave of absence," says he. And he says, "Well, I'd like to think it was permanent." So we cut from the dodgiest of dodgy boozers back to the Cross Keys and the definite the definite distinction between the two. And they're sitting having a nice meal. And Norma says, "Well, that was delicious, Dennis. Thank you very much, love." And he says, "Do you want a sweet?" And she says, "I shouldn't really, but I might think about it later." And she says to the waitress, "Give us a few minutes." And Dennis says, "Nothing for me. I'll have a brandy, though, when you've got 5 minutes." And he's, sculling his glass of wine as well. And Norma says, "I must say, this is a rare treat for me, Den." And he says, "Well, it's a thank you, Norma. Thank you for giving us bed and board, doing me laundry, putting up with me moods and helping us with the kids when they come over." And Norma says, "This place can't be cheap, though." And he says, "It's all right. I'll lay some of it off on Ali. Consultations with the architect." And she says, "Well, he can afford it. He'll never notice the difference. Do you know, I saw that Vicky in Phoenix about a month ago, and she had a coat on that would have paid for this one." So Phoenix is a big department store that was on that still is there. It's on Northumberland Street in Newcastle. Yeah. Very big department store in the centre of.
Yeah, there's one in New Bond Street in London as well.
Yeah. So, but it was Phoenix window at Christmas. They decorate the window, and it's like it's a big thing. You always take the kids down. You always used to get taken down to see Phoenix window when you were a kid.
Yeah.
So. Dennis says, "She's done all right for herself, young Vicky. Mind you, I've always said she'd go far with legs like that." Norma says, "How long though, Den?" He says, "Oh, I just admire them, Norma. I've never measured them." She says, "Norman, I'm talking about how long before Ali Fraser dumps her, or before he dumps you, for that matter." And he says, "Oh, let's not start on Ali again." And she goes, "I can't help it, Den. I don't like the man. He gives me the creeps. And I hate you working for him. And don't tell me you enjoy it, because I know you don't. I know why you're doing it, of course, for the bands." And he says, "I wouldn't be here if I didn't." And she says, "Yes, but you're trying to pretend you're happy, and I know you're not. That's you." He says, that's why you haven't been in touch with Neville or any of your friends. You try and hide it from me, but I can see right through you, Den. I can see the strain you're under." And he says, "Well, this isn't helping, is it?" And she says, "See what I mean? See how edgy you are? And you've been drinking far too much." So she's having a right go at him about the drink. And he says, "Just because I've ordered a brandy." She goes, "It's got nothing to do with that. I'm talking about the number of empties I've got to throw away every single week." And Dennis is like, "Oh, look, man. Let's not have another row, Norma. At least the job I've got now suits me fine. I'm doing what I know, what I'm best at. I've got a team of lads who are doing a hard day's graft 6 days a week, so there's no problem, okay? Let me," and Norma shrugs and he says, "Let me see the sweet trolley, yeah?" And then Oz enters and he's like, "Oh, Christ." And she goes, "Who is it?" And he just goes, "Problems." And Oz comes over, he's like, whoa, how Den? And he's like, how was? And he's like, hello, Norma, again, and the shake.
And he has the jacket on, doesn't he?
He does, yeah. And she's like, hello, Pet. And he says, I'll read. And he goes, it's a canny place, thou, but isn't it? Nice nosh. You know. And Norma says, it's lovely. He says, I bet it is. And then the waitress brings the sweet trolley over, and there's a pile of strawberries, and he just starts. He hoys one in the air and catches it. And Dennis says, are you all here? And he says, aye. And he throws the strawberries and catches in his mouth. He says, we're in the back bar. We've been scouring for action. And Norma says, did you find any? He says, what room do you? He says, you must be joking. More chance of finding a nun in a knocking shop. And the maitre d', he straight away obviously notices us, and he tries to find out what the crack is. And he diplomatically says, excuse me, sir, is this gentleman joining you? And Dennis says, no. And Oz comes and he says, all right, I got you. And he grabs a handful of strawberries. He says, well, look, if you fancy a snack, he says, if you fancy a schneck lifter, we'll be in the back bar when you finish. And he stuffs the strawberries into his mouth and he walks off like, and Norma says, "Tra, Pet." And Oz walks out and the sweet trolley's put next to the table. And Dennis says, what do you fancy? He says, I think I'll have the cream caramel, please. And she says, do you want cream? And she says, I better not. And Dennis says, nothing for me, thanks. Can I have that brandy, please? He's chasing it up. He's desperate for his drink. And the waitress says, oh, yes, sir. And he says, a large one. So again, Dennis is still bang on the pace. And then Norma, she's obviously got something to say, and now's the time she's going to say it. She says, well, when I was in the video shop, I talked to Audie Charles. And he says, seems she's been chatting to this woman and your name came up in the conversation. This woman said that you owe Ali Fraser money. And Dennis reacts very strongly, says, what? Who? Which woman? And she says, look, I don't know who it was, man. It was a friend of Audie's. The point is it true? Is that why he's got such a hold over you? And Dennis reacts quite strongly. He says, I haven't got any, he goes, he hasn't got any sort of hold over me. Look, the reason I work for Ali is because he trusts me. He's surrounded by so many arse lickers that they'd be pushed to find an if he said hello. And she says, Dennis, do you mind? And he says, look, in case you haven't noticed, Norma, you can't be too choosy about the work you do anymore, especially up our way. And the waitress brings the brandy and he says, thank you. And Norma says, look, man, it's not that I'm trying to get at you. Of course not. And she says, look, I'm just concerned about your state of mind. And he's decking his brand. He says, I'm concerned about your health. And he puts his glass down. He says, well, don't be. So they cut to the bar. And obviously the lads are ingratiating themselves into the local populace. So Oz,
well, trying to.
well, yeah, and failing. So Oz pushing his way through, he says, chuck the drinks away. Yeah, Bum. And he says, here you are. And then Wayne approaches a young couple sat at a table and he says, are you from round here? And obviously they're clearly not interested in having a conversation. And he says, yes. And he says, well, what do you do when the pub's shut? And very sarcastically, he says, well, I go home. And Wayne tries to make a joke, and he says, so it's all around to your place, is it? He says, yeah, Bum, we'll bring a bottle, eh? And he puts on a fake smile. And he realizes that he's not getting anywhere with that. And he says, no, what I mean is, are there any clubs or anything to go to? And the woman says, you mean a disco? And he says, well, I don't mean a rugby club, do I, love it? She goes, like, she sort of looks away, and she's like, oh, she goes, you'd have to go into Chesterfield. And he says, well, that's a bit of a schlep, ain't it? He said, we get so pie-eyed with her end up in a ditch or being breathalyzed. Obviously, clearly just intended on drinking and driving. And anyway, so Barry and Neville are at the other end, and Barry says, it's a nice place, isn't it? Very attractive, very upmarket clientele, isn't it? And Neville says, well, they don't seem too enthralled to see us. And he says, well, that's because we're townies, isn't it, Nev? And he says, it's a bit more than that, Barry, man. It's another country round here. And again, this is the title of the episode. And he says, I tell you what it is, I feel more of a foreigner here than I did in Germany. Barry says, you're very conscious of your working class origins, are you, Nev? He says, I've noticed that about you. And he says, well, you're working class. And he says, yeah. He says, but I've always been a very good social mixer, you see. He says, because I refuse to conform to the rigid rules that society imposes, you see. I refuse to acknowledge class barriers. That's the tragedy of this country, Nev, you know, the bloody polarization of the classes. That's why I joined the SDP, mate. And he says, it's the party of the future, that is, mate, which obviously, you know, as we now know, it wasn't. And he says, where the old class warfare will be meaningless. He says, you know, sometimes if you ever really consider that about things, and then anyway, there's the old fella starts staring at Barry, and he says, do you realize you're sitting on my stool? Barry says, what? He says, you're sitting on my stool. Says, I've just been away for 5 minutes. That's my gin and tonic on the bar. Like, as this bloke thinks he fucking owns the place. And Neville says, that's all right. He hasn't drunk it. And anyway, Oz sees there's a bit of bother. He says, what's the beef here? And he says, it's all right, no problem. He says, I'm sat on this gentleman's stool, he says. And the barman says, is there anything wrong, Mr. Treadway? And he says, chap sitting on my stool. And now Oz. Oh, you cut off for a second there, young George. It's all right, you're back. And he says, and Oz says, he says, what are you talking about? Your stool? And obviously Barry's like, oh, and he says, no, hold on. He says, you're trying to tell us that you bring that stool out with you when you come out for a drink, like. He says, you get to the door with your stool under your arm and you say, I'm just going over the pub, pet, for a pint with me stool, eh? And the other lads giggle. And he says, and Treadway says, who are you? He says, who am I? He says, my name's Osborne, what for, like? And he goes, I shall report you. And I'm like, report you, like, to who? You know, he's gone from being... He's gone from being Mr. I'll tell you what to do to Mr. I'll report you. You know, I fucking hate people like that. You know what I mean? They kick up a stink. And as soon as you kick up one back, they threaten to run to the old bill and that. Absolute fucking pussies. So, and then Wayne again tries to make a bit of a joke. He says, well, you lose a bit of face if you do that, mate, because that'll make you a stool pigeon.
Pigeon.
Yeah, stool pigeon. And then the guy said to the table, he said, somebody should throw those people out. And Bomber straight away says, oh, yes.
Yeah.
And obviously they all shit themselves at the sight of Bomber. And Oz, he accidentally goes, oh, would you like another drink, Mr. Busbridge? And Bomber says, what a good idea, Mr. Osborne. And he says, righty-ho then. He says, yeah, you're Chuck. He says, what is it? And he says, and Bomber says, I'll have a large Smirnoff. And Oz says, large Smirnoff in there, son. And I'll have a large Glenfiddich with a nice big chunk of ice floating in it. And the barman's not having any of it. He says, sorry, it's time. He says, it's time. She's still serving over there. And he goes, their residence. He goes, well, that's Harry. My mate's a resident, Mr. Patterson. He's having a scran next door in the restaurant. And Neville just says, I didn't.
Scran.
Didn't bother Dennis. That's a proper Geordie word, a scran.
Yeah.
He says, I didn't bother Dennis. He says, Osman. He says, I'm not going to bother him. We'll just put it down on his slate. We'll give him it back in the morning. And the barman just says, sorry. And Barry says, well, we don't have to. Well, why don't we just have a last one back at the barley moor? And now fucking Mr. Treadway starts getting a bit brave again. He says, yes, why don't you do that? And I was like, oh, you're still here, are you? And like, so that would be the normal turn of phrase you'd expect Oz to start headbutting people. And anyway, so we cut back, and Dennis and Norma are finished, and the maitre d' says, everything all right? And he says, yeah, fine, thank you, smashing a good night. And he says, good night. And then and just as they're leaving the restaurant, they're in the reception, and they witness Oz causing a bit of a kerfuffle on the way out. And he says, all right, man. And he says, we're going now, I'll read. He says, we'll not be coming back neither. He says, you know where I come from. People are hospitable towards strangers. He says, but you lot, you've made us about as welcome as a fart in an astronaut suit. So the next day, Barry and Neville are leaving the barley moor, and Neville is going off to his job. Neville says, it's not too far, just a couple of miles down the road. And Barry says, not bothered. He says, I've got nothing to do, ever. And Neville says, I hope the other lads don't mind. It's just I'm doing that past me time working and sitting about, you know. Barry says, I've always thought work was a very therapeutic, actually, Nev. And Oz sticks his head out the window. He says, where are you two going? He says, I'm giving Nev a lift to this job he's got. He says, hold on, I'll come down with you now else to D. So they pull up, Barry's van is pulling up at this big mansion, which is the residence of Sir James. And Neville says, it's a lovely place there. And he says, it must have a bob or two to have this mate. And Neville says, hey, listen, he says, if we want some extra hands, would you lads be interested? And Oz says, no. And he says, it's always pocket money though, isn't it? And Oz, he says, money might be your god, Nev, but it's clear, he says, but it's certainly not mine. Anyway, Nev says, thanks, Barry. He says, ta-ra for a bit. And he says, oh, I have a nice, and Barry drives off. So Nev walks around the back, knocks on the door, and the lady and there's a lady and a baby in the kitchen. So the baby, do we know who the baby is, George?
I don't. I didn't delve that far in. No.
So the baby is actually played by Jimmy Neal's son. So that is Jimmy Neal's child that's being used in the thing. So we've got the two. We've got Sir James, you mentioned before, David Neville.
Yeah.
He's got 42 credits. And like you say, Fawlty Towers, George and Mildred. He was in Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. He was in Just Good Friends. And he also was in the obligatory episode of Boone. And like you say, he is quite typecast in that sort of posh type of person. So
but I tell you, my favourite line that he done in Fawlty Towers is that he said to Fawlty, do you remember Fawlty was looking for the rat, and he was looking in the girlfriend's handbag, and he said, you're getting my gander up, you grubby little man.
Getting
my gander up, you grubby little man.
Yeah, it was the rat, wasn't it? So so his name is David Neville. So his wife, who's got a really funny name that we come across later on, I can't remember. The actress who plays the wife, her name is
Sarah. She looked familiar, but she looked familiar. I didn't look into her, but she looked familiar.
Her name is Sarah Neville. So his name is David Neville. Yes. Her name is Sarah Neville, no relation, and they're playing a scene with Neville. So there's actually 3 Nevilles on the TV at the same time. And so she has got 28 credits on IMDb. She's been on Brookside, also been on Bergerac, but where you may remember her from, she did 114 episodes of Emmerdale Farm. So,
that's maybe where I know her from.
Yeah. Maybe. I mean, I can't really say that I'm a big fan, but yes. So like I say, the kid is Jimmy Neal's real kid in real life, and there is a plethora of Nevilles on the screen. So Neville comes up and like I say, knocks on the door, and like I say, the woman is in with the kid, and he says, hello, I'm Neville Hope. I think I spoke to your husband this morning. And she says, oh, you've come to help us out. Yes. And he says, why don't you come in? Don't worry about your feet. House is full of dogs and babies. James won't be long. He's in the barn. Would you like some tea? And he's like, great, thanks. She said, sorry, the place is such a mess. And Neville starts talking to the kid. He's like, hello. And she goes, that grubby little thing is Henry, which, like I say, is Jimmy Neal's kid. And he says, I've got a little girl at home, just 2. Debbie, I miss her, actually. And she goes, I like them when they're 2. They're really boring at this age. And he says, smashing house. And she goes, well, it's not very practical, and it's a bugger to heat. So we go back to see Barry's van driving down the country road. And he says, where do you want to go, Oz? And he says, there's nowhere on this bloody map. And he says, we could always go to Staveley. And Oz says, what for? And he says, I don't know. He says, well, let's not bother then. And Barry says, well, when we were in the Falcons, I didn't half used to think about England a lot. And he says, I used to dream about days like this. Motor, time in hand, open road, sun shining on the cows in the meadow. And then Oz makes a joke and he puts his hand and he says, just me and you alone together, Barry. And he touches Barry's leg and Barry's like, oh, pig off, get off. And he says, I was close to that in the Falklands, I can tell you that. And Barry says, well, he says, what I'm talking about is I used to dream about this, but now I've got it. I don't know what to do with it. And Oz says, I know what to do, pull over. And he says, look, Oz, I've told you to cut it out, right? He says, no, seriously, man. He says, really, do you want the joys of the English countryside, don't you? He says, yeah. He says, right, well, pull over. He says, there you go. And the pull over, and he says, there you go. And he says, yeah, it's a river. He says, yes, it's a river. And with a bit of luck, it'll be chock-a-block with trout, won't it? He says, how are you? And he says, we'll go and get our supper. So we see that we go back to the barley moor, and Bomber is being brought a cup of tea by Carol, young Carol. And he says, thank you, my dear. Service with a smile makes a change round here. And she says, father's hopeless, and he wonders why the place is always empty. And then Wayne comes in, morning, Bomb, and he says, morning. He says, hello, love. And she says, someone looks like they had a good night. And he says, yeah, we emptied 6 pubs. And Bomb says, we've had more exciting evenings. And Wayne says, that game of Skittles we had in the Green Dragon was a blinder though, wasn't it? A right cliffhanger. She says, do you want a cup of tea? And he says, that'll be magic, love. And he says, yeah, this place is on the up and up. We'll be having bunny girls next. And she comes back with a mug of tea and pours away, and she says, it's only for the day. Dad's gone to Sheffield. As I always said, I'd look after the place. And Wayne says, I'll give you a hand if you want, love. I can pull pints. And Bomber just looks up and he says, that's not what you want to pull.
You want to pull.
So we cut back to Oz and Barry at the river. And Oz is taking his boots off. And Barry says, you can't do this sort of thing without rods and flies and such like. And he says, watch and learn. And he says, what are you going to do? He says, I'm going to tickle them. And he says, tickle them, man. Because I used to do this when I was a young'un. There was a little stream when I used to go camping in Rothbury. He says, when I was a kid, just like this. He said, and Barry says, there used to be a stream near us when I was a lad, but nothing used to live in it though. And he says, there's a one. He says, where is it? He says, and Barry goes, where is it? He goes, what are you whispering for? They can't hear you. And he says, well, I don't know, do I? He says, well, they like to hang about in the reeds, you see. And he says, get your coat off. He says, what for? He says, get your coat off, man. So when I throw it, it might try to wriggle back in the water because they're gutsy little bastards. They'll put up a fight. He says, oh, my coat will get all fishy. And he goes, do you want a fish supper or not? And he goes, all right. And so, well, get your coat off then. And he proceeds to try and tickle the trout. Now, just out of interest, that's not how you tickle fish. You have to, if you want to tickle a trout, you've got to lie on the bank and reach over, and they hang around like in the overhang bank, and you tickle them like that and scoop them out. Yeah. He said, like if you got into the river like that, the fish would fuck off. So anyway, he says, I'm stroking. Yeah. He says, slow, gentle. He says, just like you would do with a woman, really. And Barry makes a joke. He goes, I'd like mine off the bone, please. And he goes, shut up. And he throws the fish at Barry, and Barry screams. He goes, it's a bloody flying fish. And he says, get it, man. And you can see it's heading back into the water. He says, get it, man, get it. He says, it's all wriggly and alive. And the fish goes back into the water. And Oz says, well done, you pillock. And he says, sorry, I can't. I've never done this before, have I? He goes, well, look, the next time, don't just stand there like a petrified matador, I'll reach. So we cut and see Neville doing the bit of work for Sir James. And they're basically clearing out junk. And Sir James, he says, so many of these houses have these old stables and barns. says they just stand around doing nothing except decay. He says, so I thought I'd utilise this, make a games room for the kids and an office for myself, the sort of thing one's always planning to do, but has never had the money or the time to get around to it. And Neville says, oh, I know what you mean. I've been promising to retile our bathroom for the last 2 years. And he says, what do you think, Neville? Would it cost an absolute fortune? He says, I wouldn't have thought so. You'll have to run cable in. Like, he says, the roof's not bad. Let's have a look. He says, might need a bit of insulation. So we are back, and they have caught a couple we're back on the river, and they've caught a couple of trout, and Barry is playing with a fish's mouth, basically. And he's going, hello. And then Barry looks up and he sees the gamekeeper coming, and he says, oh, look, there's someone coming. And Oz is like, where? He goes, oh, but look there. He goes, he's heading this way. And Barry's oblivious to what's going on. And he says, he's waving at us. And Barry's like, hello. And he goes, get your jacket on. He says, hey, get your jacket on, man. And he puts the fish in his pockets. And he says, what's the rush all of a sudden? He goes, I want to have a go myself. He goes, he might be the bloody gamekeeper. And Barry penny drops. He's gamekeeper. He goes, are you trying to tell me this is illegal or something? And he goes, well, of course, poaching's not legal, is he? Is it? And Barry says, poaching? He goes, you never told me about bloody poaching. And he goes, well, I don't think this place is open to the public, do you? He goes, people pay a fortune to run a river, man. He goes, well, how serious is it then? He goes, well, let's put it this way. He goes, if they catch me, he goes, I don't think we'll make the Crown Court. And Barry says, well, you might have bloody said so. And so they jump into Barry's van and they drive off. So we cut back to the
pub.
So Bomber's on the fruit machine, and Wayne and Carol are clearly enamored with each other and being very flirtatious and touchy-feely and tactile with each other. And she disappears upstairs, and obviously Wayne is desperate to follow her. And he says to Bomber, he says, Bomb, he says, what? He says, time, gentlemen, please. He goes, what are you talking about? And two. And he goes, oh, use your savvy. And he goes, you never give it a rest, do you, Wayne? He goes, oh, be a mate, Bum. He goes, what am I supposed to do? He goes, well, you could get something to eat. He goes, I've eaten. I went down the cafe at 11:30. He goes, what if I gave you a couple of quid to go to the pictures? And he goes, there isn't a cinema miles. And he goes, the ultimate gesture, Bum, the keys to me car. He says, now, apparently there's this lovely waterfall down the road, very picturesque it is. And Bomber reluctantly...
That's the second time they mentioned the waterfall, yeah.
Well, obviously, I think Wayne's just, bringing it up. And I don't think he's expecting Bomber to go. And anyway, so Bomber takes Wayne's car keys and leaves, and Wayne flicks he turns the minute hand round to 2:30, and then he says to the other blank, and he goes, excuse me, sir. And then he looks and he points and he points at the clock, and the guy finishes his drink. So obviously Wayne is about to go and get himself a little bit of action with young Carol. So we cut to the village, and we see the gamekeeper in his Land Rover, and he pulls up and he sees Barry's van parked, and they're in a cafe, and Oz and Barry are having something to eat, and Oz says, more tea, and he says, no, I'm all right, cheers, Oz. And then Barry looks out the window and says, there's that bloke. And he says, what bloke? He says, the gamekeeper. He says, oh, and Oz panics. He says, get the bill. And he goes to his jacket and he takes the trout out of his pocket, and you see him move the trout, and you don't actually see him what. So Barry's paying the bill, and the gamekeeper comes in and challenges Oz, and he says, excuse me. And he says, yes, what? He says, about half an hour ago, you and your mate were down by the river, weren't you? And Oz says, what river? He goes, you know perfectly well what river. And Oz says, did we pass a river today on our travels? And Barry's like, I think we did when we were having our walk, yes. And the gamekeeper says, you had no right to walk there. That's private property, that is. And Barry says, well, we weren't supposed to know that, sir. Because we're not from round here, you see. And the gamekeeper says, well, there's notices posted. You can read where you come from, can't you? And this gets Oz's back. And he says, just a minute. He says, there's no call for that. And then the lady says, excuse me, and comes.
Gets her coat.
She's going to get her coat and her stuff. And And Oz says, are you trying to tell me that all these acres of land and we can't bloody walk on them? And the bloke, he says, there are public footpaths. He goes, I'm not talking about the footpaths. I'm talking about all those miles of fields and moor out there. Me and him were in the Falklands, you know. The Falklands. And Oz is making a show of it now. He says, I am one of the only things what kept her going out there was the thought that, he says getting back here and hopefully walking once again through England's green and pleasant land. What we thought about. It says what we fought to preserve. And Barry fucking, he says, well, we weren't actually there during the hostilities, like drops him in it. He says, we were there rebuilding the land, would have been ravaged, weren't we, by the invader. And the gamekeeper sort of calms down a bit. He's like, well, that doesn't give you the right to go poaching. And Oz now, he's like, poaching for what? He goes, trout. He goes, trout. He goes, can you see any fishing rods, like? And he goes, have you got a fishing rod stuck down your trousers, says to Barry. And he goes, you can tickle them. He goes, you can tickle them. And he gets all stark. He goes, have you heard this? You can tickle them. What, I suppose you tickle them until they're so weak with laughing that they jump out the river and into the pan. Is that it? Tickle them. And he says, have you any idea how serious an offence it is? And Oz says, look, he says, before you go talking about offences, you need evidence, don't you? Right, so I'll tell you what we'll do. He says, his van's parked outside, so you can go and search it, right? And you can search him and you can search me. All right, that's fair. Come on. And they put the arms up to get a dry bath. And he says, this is typical, typical of the welcome you people give strangers. But I'm telling you, if you don't find anything, I want a public apology, right? And obviously Barry is, all worried because Barry doesn't realise that Oz has got rid of the evidence. And the gamekeeper obviously finds nothing. And he's like, aye, yeah. And he says, we'll go and try the van. He says, I try the van. So Barry looks down at the floor near the coat stand and shakes his coat. And Barry's like dumbfounded that the fish have disappeared. And he's like, and he goes, Oz. And he goes, shh. And he shoves Barry. He goes, get it open. He goes, right, an apology. And he points at the gamekeeper. And Barry's finding his keys. And then, so they're outside, they're at Barry's van. And just at the same time, the woman is at her car and she's looking for something. And she goes into her pockets and she finds the trout that Oz has stashed in her jacket pocket. And she throws it on the bonnet of her car and screams. And then pulls another trout out and throws that on the car and screams. So we cut back to Sir James's property. And the Nevilles are all sitting there having something to eat, and the phone rings. And so the wife says, that could be Robert. He called earlier about the picture frame. Do you want another scone, Neville? And he says, "Tar, very much." And Sir James answers the phone. He goes, "Hello. Oh, really? Very well. I'll come down." And she says, "Who was it?" He goes, "It was the police. Jessup caught a couple of chaps poaching." And Neville says, "Is that serious?" He goes, "Well, it wasn't my father's day, but I never shared his enthusiasm for shooting game, catching fish, or flogging poachers. Darling, I'm going to have to go into town." And she goes, "All right." And he says, "Neville, why don't you come with me? I can drop you off afterwards." And he says, "All right." So we're back at the Cross Keys, and so Dennis and Norma are looking through an Egon Ronay guide. And
the menu. Yeah.
And he says, he's talking about a place. He says, "This one sounds all right. The Pheasant at Ilworth." And he says, "This old coaching inn has been lovingly restored by Trevor Beaumont, while his partner, Nigel Fox, run the kitchen." And Dennis has a little bit of a sneaky grin at that one. I'm assuming that he's obviously making the assumption that when it says partner, it's run by a gay couple. And it says, "Local produce, fresh vegetables, among their specialities. We particularly recommend the rack of lamb and local fresh trout." Now, obviously, they're talking about local trout, and Oz and Barry have just been getting in trouble for local fresh trout. And she says, "That sounds good." And he says, "We'll give that a go later on." And she says, "Definitely." And he says, "Right, I better book." And Bomber walks in and he says, "Oh, hello, Bomber." And he says, Dennis says, "What have you been up to?" He says, "Well, I've been driving around this countryside and I picked up a hitchhiker." And Moxie's there. And he says, "Moxie." And he says, "Hello, Den." He says, "I don't think you met my sister Norma. This is Moxie and Bomber." And she says, "Hello." And he says, Says, everything all right? He says, yeah. He says, I've had to go down to London, sort a few things out, but I got me cards, so there should be no more problems in that department. He says, oh, champion, because the architect tells me we'll be back at work on Monday with a bit of luck, so you've timed it rather well, Moxie. And he says, Den. And he says, yeah. And he says, I'm not Moxie anymore. And he says, what? And he says, I'm Brendan Mullicky. And he goes, Brendan what? And he goes, Mullicky. And he goes, and Norma says, she says, Dennis, shall I order some more tea for everyone? And Dennis says, I think it's about time for a drink, isn't it, lads? And Bomber says, I wouldn't say no to that. And he says, aye, come on. He says, why not? Come on, let's have a drink. Things seem to be shaping up for once. And then the famous last words, he says, and then the waitress says, Mr. Patterson, could you come to the phone, please? He says, yeah. He says, it's the police. A couple of your lads have been arrested. So we cut to the police station. We cut to the police station, which was actually a real police station that they used. And obviously, so Neville arrives with Sir James and they go in the police station, and the gamekeeper, who we now find out is called Jessup, he says, good afternoon, Sir James, I'm sorry about this. And he says, are those the chaps? And he says, yes, sir, I caught them red-handed. And he says, oh dear. And he says, so what do I? And he turns to the policeman. He says, so what do I do? And Neville says, excuse me, Sir James, could I have a word with you? He says, of course. He says, no, I mean in private. So they go outside. And Neville says, those two poachers, they're my workmates. And obviously Barry and Oz. And he says, really? He says, I'm sure they wouldn't have known what they were doing. I mean, they wouldn't have known it was your property. And he says, I suppose not. He says, see, we're townies, aren't we? He says, I suppose so. He says, the thing is, they take a dim view of that kind of thing. And being the landowner, I'm supposed to set an example. And he says, well, they could make an amends. He says, how? He says, well, instead of paying the fine, maybe they could help me fix your barn. So Neville's getting them out of it. He says, well, that does seem a lot of fuss about nothing. And he says, and Celestia, that's her name, Celestia and I could have that trout for supper. And so Bomber says, and then obviously Dennis arrives in Wayne's car. And he says, what's happening? He says, what's happening, Nev? And he says, it's all right, Dennis. Sir James and I have fixed everything. So they go back, and the cars pull up, and Oz, he makes a comment about how, because Nev, he says, we're part of the local gentry now that Nev is in with the knobs. And obviously Wayne is sat with everyone's bags. And they're about to enter the Barleymoor, and then obviously they see Wayne, and they're like, and Wayne, he goes, where have you lot been? He goes, I'm bloody freezing. And Dennis says, never mind that. He goes, what's happening here? He says, well, Arthur's chucked us out, hasn't he? And I was like, why can't it do that, man? And he says, well, he can. It's his pub, and he's done it, hasn't he? And Bomber says, we've got to have a reason, no? He says, well, he's always been a bit iffy about us being here, ain't he? Neville says, but we're paying customers now, though. And he says, but we do make a lot of noise, and some of us occasionally go over the top. And Oz says, well, maybe once. And he says, but you did kick his jukebox, didn't you? And he weren't too happy about that, was he? And Oz says, oh, I might have known it would be down to me again, as usual. And Wayne sort of tries to encourage them. He says, come on, let's load it up, eh? Thinking Wayne's trying to think he can get away with it. Harry's like, hold on a tick. He says, I'm not taking this.
Yeah.
And Moxie says, it's got nothing to do with me. He goes, I've never stayed there once. And Dennis says, he says, come here a minute. He says, look, if he's turfing the whole six of us lot, of you lot out, he says, you must have put up some sort of black. He says, what have you been up to, like? So obviously Dennis is, and Wayne then realizes that he's got to fess up. And he says, well, I suppose finding me, he says, I suppose him finding me in bed with his daughter had something to do with it. Clearly caught in flagrante with young Carol. Yeah. And obviously straight away the lads react very badly, and Wayne runs off and they chase him through the car park. And that is the end of the episode. Yeah. So Wayne's philandering gets the boys into trouble once again. And there was a lot of people in the episode. There's a lot of credits. So Ali Fraser and Kenny Ames get a credit together. Arthur Pringle, Carol Pringle and Norma get a credit together. Howard Radcliffe, the gamekeeper and Vicky, Sergeant Ives, Treadway, Mrs. Bryant, and the Irishman. Can't remember who Mrs. Bryant was. Maybe that was the shopkeeper or something. James Palmer, so obviously Sir James, Celestia Palmer, and Henry Palmer. So Henry Palmer was indeed Oz's son. It was the cafe owner, the lorry driver, and the young couple in the bar. The elderly man, the maitre d', Fiona, the beautiful young Fiona is still there, and the barman. So that is it for series 2, episode 4, or Another Country. So again, a bit of a sort of a bit of a hodgepodge of an episode where they are not at work, but we are about to see the lads get back to work next episode. So if any of our fantastic listeners or viewers have any comment about this episode, Another Country, please do feel free to contact us by email on aufwiedersehenagain@gmail.com. Please do follow the Instagram page, Auf Wiedersehen Again Podcast, @Auf Wiedersehen Again Podcast. Please do follow the Twitter, @AufAgain. Please do like and share the Facebook page, Auf Wiedersehen Again Podcast. Please do subscribe to our YouTube channel, Auf Wiedersehen Again Podcast, and click the bell to alert you to any new episodes. Or if audio is your thing, we are available on all good podcast platforms, Spotify, iTunes, Anchor, Google, Breaker, and many, many more. New episodes are released every Friday at 10 a.m. and our theme music is composed and performed by Lee Dosky. So we please do ask, please do like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and please do tell your friends. Our sponsors, remember our Top Gun Tattooing, number 12, the Harris Arcade in Reading. That's topguntattoo.co.uk, 01189 968 667. And you can get your 20% discount by contacting Zach with the code Hadaway and Shiteman. And you can also get your free Neville and Lockie tattoo by emailing us in at aufwiedersehenagain@gmail.com. And don't forget, we are running the competition on our social medias for the original signed picture copy of the cast in episode. So if you would like to win that fantastic prize, we'll keep it going for at least another week. So if you would like to win that fantastic prize, please do so by entering the competition on the social medias. And my interview that I did with Sean, what do you call him? The podcast with the 17th, isn't it? 17th? It's out on Thursday. So by the time people hear this on Friday, you can go to YouTube and you can type in what's his name? Sean, I can't remember the name now. So you can type it in. We'll put a link up on the social media.
Well, you put a link up anyway, wouldn't you?
Put a link up on the social medias when it's live, and you can listen to me talk shit about some of the things that I've done in my life, talk about door work, some of the big tear-ups I had working on the door, working in foreign countries and the like. So yes, so some very, very interesting things. So that's it for this week, George. So, until next week, Auf Wiedersehen, Pet.
Auf Wiedersehen.
Oh, yeah, man. All out of options, nothing to choose. I've been out on Netflix, I'm sick of the news. I'd sign up to Sky, but I don't want to pay. I've been on